Bobby Fuller's story is one of those fascinating rock and roll sagas that mix ambition, grit, mystery, and tragedy into a single, gripping narrative. It's a tale that begins in the Texas heat of Baytown and spans the dusty streets of El Paso, ultimately shining beneath the neon lights of 1960s Los Angeles, only to end in a swirl of suspicion that continues to intrigue fans and investigators decades later. If you listen carefully, you can almost hear the faint echo of Buddy Holly's guitar, sense the intense energy of a blossoming rock scene, and taste the rebellious spirit of a generation ready to break the rules. But behind the catchy melodies and the heartbreak of "I Fought the Law," behind the determined twang of a young Texan determined to make it big, lies a complex web of associations and unanswered questions that have never been fully resolved. Bobby was born on October 22, 1942, in Baytown, Texas, a place that was, in many ways, the cradle of America's oil-centric progress. It wasn't exactly a hotspot for rock music or teenage dreams, yet the spark of creativity sometimes flares brightest in the most unlikely corners. The Fuller family eventually moved to El Paso in 1956, during a period when the United States was swooning for rockabilly, the early echoes of surf rock, and the rebellious allure of rock and roll. It was a decade marked by cultural metamorphosis, and a young Bobby Fuller seemed determined not just to ride that wave, but to help shape it. Even before adolescence was fully behind him, he was tinkering with instruments, absorbing influences, and watching the radio charts like they were signposts on his own personal highway to stardom. El Paso, situated on the border between Texas and Mexico, had a vibrant cultural mix that would eventually find its way into Bobby's music. But at first, the city might have seemed like a dead end for a dreamer who admired Buddy Holly and wanted to create something that resonated on a national stage. Still, he turned that potential disadvantage into an advantage. If you couldn't find a suitable music venue, you built one. If no one was going to hand you a recording studio, you fashioned it yourself, learning the technical aspects of producing sound along the way. And that's exactly what Bobby did when he set up Bobby Fuller's Teen Rendezvous, a club that was less a commercial venture and more an energetic epicenter for El Paso's youth culture. He wanted a place where teenagers could gather, dance, and experience live rock music without traveling hundreds of miles to a bigger city. The place thrived. Local kids loved him not just because he was a decent musician or because he had a friendly face, but because Bobby embodied something intangible. He was proof that big dreams and big creativity could thrive in a border town. He even built a rudimentary but functional recording setup, capturing the essence of the early 1960s music scene in reel-to-reel tapes. As a self-taught musician, producer, and entrepreneur, he was blazing a trail that few others his age dared to attempt. Not only was he playing guitar and singing, but he was learning how to capture sound, shape it, and present it in a way that made people's pulses quicken. Talent, drive, curiosity. Bobby had them all, and his local fans noticed. The group he formed, initially called the Fanatics, would morph into the Bobby Fuller Four. The name shift was more than just a branding move. It signaled Bobby's increasing focus on establishing a real identity and a definable sound. That sound borrowed heavily from Buddy Holly's melodic tendencies, tight vocals, clear, ringing guitar lines, and a sense of earnestness that cut through the noise. There was also a dash of Tex-Mex flavor, a natural byproduct of living in a bilingual region. All these elements would one day lead to the distinct Bobby Fuller sound. By the time they generated a local following, Bobby's desire to push beyond the El Paso horizon burned hotter than the West Texas sun, and that heat propelled him straight toward the the bright lights of Los Angeles. In 1964, Bobby made the leap, trading the desert landscapes of Texas for the palm trees and traffic-filled boulevards of LA was no small decision. The city was buzzing with musical possibilities and the gravitational pull of the record industry. Los Angeles at that time was a collision of surf rock, garage bands, folk revival, and the beginnings of psychedelia. The Beatles had just ignited the so-called British invasion in the U.S., and American rockers were scrambling to keep up with the new wave of sounds crossing the Atlantic. It was a creative cauldron, and Bobby, with his unstoppable energy, was eager to jump right into the stew. He and his band signed with Bob Keane's Delphi Records, later known as Mustang Records. Keane was somewhat of an industry veteran. He'd worked with Richie Valens, which lent him a degree of fame and credibility. But Keane's reputation wasn't universally spotless. Rumors circulated that he had connections to figures who walked the tightrope between legitimate business and the murkier shadows of organized crime. In mid-century music circles, such associations weren't all that unusual. Mob involvement in clubs, distribution, and promotional channels was an open secret. But for a wide-eyed newcomer like Bobby, it was risky terrain. Nevertheless, the collaboration with Keane brought Bobby the kind of exposure he had always craved. He was in the big leagues now. The Bobby Fuller Four got studio time, promotional backing, and a shot at real nationwide radio play. The hustle paid off. In 1966, they released a cover of I Fought the Law, a track originally written by Sonny Curtis of the Crickets, Buddy Holly's band. The raw, galvanizing energy of Bobby's take on the song propelled it up the Billboard Hot 100, peaking at number 9th in March of that year. This was it, the moment that every aspiring rocker dreams about, hearing your song on national radio, seeing your name on the charts, and fielding requests from concert promoters left and right. The success seemed well earned. After all, Bobby had spent years honing his craft, booking his own gigs, producing his own records, and building a following. But in the heightened environment of 1960s LA, success also came with baggage, expectations from producers, demands from industry executives, performance schedules that left little room for rest or reflection. Bobby soon found himself grappling with a familiar scenario in the music business. The label wanted creative control. Keane was pushing for certain arrangements, insisting on adding strings to give the band a more polished pop sound, and nudging Bobby toward the idea of a solo career. For a fiercely independent mind like Bobby's, who prided himself on building everything from the ground up, these constraints felt stifling. By mid-1966, tension was thick in the air. The Bobby Fuller Four had just finished a grueling 3-month tour, and Bobby was exhausted, physically, mentally, and emotionally. He started confiding in close friends about his frustration with Keane's attempts to mold his music into a more commercial package. The idea of leaving Los Angeles and retreating to the comfort of El Paso loomed enticingly in his mind, like an oasis promising creative freedom. But that desire to pack up and leave didn't just signal a change in personal life. It threatened the entire investment that Delphi, Mustang, and Bob Keane had poured into him. Music industry dollars had already been spent on promotion, distribution, and establishing Bobby as a new star. If he walked out now, it would be a financial hit to people who might not take kindly to losing money. During this same period, Bobby found himself in new social circles, drifting toward crowds that indulged in the wilder side of 1960s counterculture. LSD was becoming a phenomenon in certain music scenes, an experimental drug that musicians and artists claimed expanded their consciousness. Although the exact extent of Bobby's involvement with psychedelics is debated, friends noticed changes, subtle or otherwise, in his behavior and demeanor. It was, after all, a time when almost everyone in the rock scene was dabbling in one thing or another. But some people close to Bobby worried that he was pushing boundaries he wasn't equipped to handle. As if that weren't enough, stories circulated that he was seeing a woman named Melody, whose ex or current boyfriend might have had serious mob ties. Whether these rumors held much truth or were just a product of the swirling gossip that often surrounded musicians is still open to debate, but the mere suggestion of organized crime involvement would cast a long shadow over the events about to unfold. On July 18, 1966, Bobby's life came to a screeching halt under circumstances that remain as perplexing as they are heartbreaking. His mother discovered his lifeless body in her Oldsmobile, parked awkwardly outside his Hollywood apartment. Details from that day read like the blueprint for a noir film. Bobby's clothes and hair disheveled, his body soaked in gasoline, a rubber siphoning tube in his hand, and dried blood visible on his face. Even more puzzling was the fact that the car hadn't been in the lot earlier that day. It appeared suddenly in the late afternoon, as if someone had driven it there in a hurry before vanishing. The Los Angeles Police Department, already dealing with chaos triggered by the death of LAPD Chief William H. Parker just 2 days earlier, was quick to label Bobby's death a suicide. They claimed he had ingested gasoline, a bizarre and gruesome way to end one's life, and an immediate red flag for anyone questioning the official narrative. The autopsy, performed by Deputy Medical Examiner Jerry Nelson, contradicted parts of that conclusion. There was no gasoline found in Bobby's stomach. Instead, the official cause of death was listed as asphyxia due to inhalation of gasoline vapors. This alone would be enough to raise suspicions, but the report also noted that the manner of death was questionable, labeling both accident and suicide with question marks. When an official document hedges its bets like that, one can't help but wonder what truly happened. The irregularities didn't stop there. Bobby's body was described as being in a state of advanced rigor mortis, which implied he'd been dead for several hours. Yet, people in the apartment complex insisted the car wasn't parked in that spot during much of the day. How could he have been dead that long without the body being discovered sooner? Some sources mention bruises, a possible broken finger, or other signs of a struggle, though the autopsy didn't conclusively prove a severe beating. Whether these details were sensationalized in subsequent retellings or reflect an actual oversight in the initial examination remains hotly debated. Another glaring concern was the apparent disarray in the police investigation. They neglected to dust the car for fingerprints, effectively discarding critical evidence. The gasoline can that might have offered vital clues, such as who had purchased it or handled it, was also thrown away. Witnesses in the area were not systematically interviewed. This haphazard handling of evidence might be partially explained by the departmental chaos following Chief Parker's death, but some see it as indicative of a more sinister pattern. Perhaps certain interests wanted this case closed quickly, with minimal fuss. Inevitably, theories started bubbling to the surface. One of the most persistent claims is that Bobby Fuller was the victim of a mob hit. This line of reasoning argues that because Bobby intended to leave Delphi Mustang Records, potentially costing mob-linked financiers a chunk of money, they decided he had to be silenced. People point to figures like Morris Levy of Roulette Records. As potential orchestrators of violence, men rumored to have employed strong arm tactics on multiple occasions. Keene himself suspiciously had taken out a life insurance policy on Bobby, a not entirely uncommon practice in the music industry, but one that raised eyebrows in the wake of such a murky death. Another branch of speculation posits that Bobby might have overdosed at a party that included influential or dangerous individuals, leading them to stage his death in a way that deflected blame. Some stories even place celebrities or mob-affiliated associates in that scenario, presumably wanting to avoid a scandal that could end careers or spark legal trouble. The bizarre detail of gasoline inhalation might have been contrived to throw investigators off, painting a suicide scene that nobody with a shred of common sense would believe. And yet, because the LAPD was in disarray, the official line that it was a likely suicide sailed through relatively unchallenged, at least initially. There's also a wilder, more outlandish theory that lumps Bobby Fuller's death in with the Manson family's trail of mayhem. Charles Manson was at that time still incarcerated until mid-1967, so a direct link to Manson himself makes little chronological sense. But the Manson family was a fluid group, and sometimes these conspiracy theories hinge on the possibility that certain associates of Manson were already mingling with the LA music scene well before their leader's release. However, most serious researchers view this theory as more rumor than reality, an example of how a notorious name can be attached to almost any unsolved 1960s Hollywood mystery. Then there's the angle involving Melody, the woman rumored to be linked to a boyfriend with mob affiliations. Was Bobby killed out of jealousy or retribution? Did he unwittingly step into a feud he couldn't handle? Did the tensions between him and the label, the possibility of a scorned lover, and his forays into a wilder, drug-tinged lifestyle converge into a lethal outcome? Or was the truth something simpler and more random, an accidental death misread by incompetent authorities, or a setup orchestrated to look like an accident or suicide? What truly intensifies the sense of a cover-up is that, for a long time, the official cause of death remained suicide. The coroner's ambiguous notes were quietly overlooked. Years later, public scrutiny grew, thanks in part to sensational stories and even a segment on the TV show Unsolved Mysteries. Under renewed pressure, the official cause of death was changed from suicide to accident. This move was more a bureaucratic shift than a revelation of new evidence, but it demonstrated that authorities couldn't fully stand behind the original narrative. Yet they stopped short of declaring it a homicide or reopening a cold case investigation in a meaningful way. To this day, many fans, researchers, and even members of Bobby's family remain convinced there was foul play, though definitive proof remains elusive. Bobby Fuller left behind more than a single iconic song. He left a blueprint for resilience and self-determination in an industry often dominated by powerful gatekeepers. I Fought the Law took on a life of its own after his death, covered by countless bands, most notably The Clash, who gave it a punk edge in the late 1970s. This ironically extended Bobby's posthumous influence across musical generations. Perhaps if he had lived, he would have navigated the shifting tides of late 1960s and 1970s rock, exploring everything from psychedelia to country rock, or even forging entirely new styles. But we'll never know. He was only 23, with a future that seemed radiant and endless, abruptly extinguished in a parked car on a hot summer day. The tragedy of his death is deepened by how many of his associates survived or flourished afterward. Randy Fuller, Bobby's brother, spent years trying to make sense of what happened, going so far as to co-author a book called I Fought the Law, The Life and Strange Death of Bobby Fuller, with Miriam Lina in 2015. The volume is a heartfelt tribute to Bobby's memory and a meticulous attempt to dissect the tangled threads of the case. It doesn't solve the mystery once and for all, but it does bring forward new details, contradictory testimonies, and an overarching sense that the official version of events was never sufficient. Such endeavors keep Bobby's legacy alive, shedding light on the man behind the music and reminding the world that we lost a vibrant, creative force far too soon. Among the swirl of speculation, one reality stands firm. Bobby Fuller was a talented individual who charted his own path in the music industry, defying the norms of his time. He was unafraid to build his own studio, to test the waters of production, and to carve out a venue for youth culture in El Paso when the mainstream offered few opportunities. He took that can-do spirit to Los Angeles, where he soared high enough to place a single in the top 10. Along the way, he brushed up against influential record executives, possible criminal elements, and the frenetic lifestyle of a rock scene in the throes of transformation. Whether you interpret his demise as a direct consequence of mob involvement, a drug-fueled tragedy, a cover-up, or something altogether different, you can't deny its profound effect on those who knew him or followed his music. For a time, I Fought the Law was an anthem for youthful rebellion, a raw manifestation of discontent with authority. Ironically, Bobby's life ended under circumstances that suggest he might have been fighting a law far more opaque and dangerous than the average policeman's baton. In the music world, the law sometimes includes unspoken codes, financial obligations, and alliances that can ruin careers or end lives when crossed. That's the side of the entertainment industry that rarely appears in nostalgic celebrations of the 1960s. It's a side that's more likely found in backroom deals, hushed phone calls, and cryptic threats, where the lines between legitimate business and criminal enterprise blur into a disorienting haze. Some fans have drawn parallels between Bobby's story and that of other legendary rock and roll figures who died young, leaving behind more questions than answers. Buddy Holly, Eddie Cochran, Sam Cooke, and so on. The difference here is that Bobby's death was neither a clear accident nor a confirmed homicide. It was and continues to be a question mark in the annals of rock history. On the list of unexplained musician deaths, Bobby Fuller's name stands out, partly because of the stark oddity of the scene. Gasoline-soaked clothes, a rubber hose in his hand, and partly because of the labyrinth of rumors enveloping it. Hollywood in the mid-1960s was fertile ground for all sorts of bizarre stories. It was the birthplace of the Manson family nightmare and the playground of high-flying producers with questionable ethics. It was a zone where star-struck youth from around the country arrived each day, dreaming of record deals or film contracts, and where powerful people sometimes took advantage of that naive optimism. Bobby Fuller walked into this environment with wide eyes and unstoppable ambition. Perhaps he believed his talent and determination could insulate him from the city's darker edges. Or maybe, like many artists, he never had the luxury of worrying about hidden dangers while he was too busy chasing his muse. Regardless, the result was a heartbreak that resonates all these years later. In the aftermath, tributes popped up in unexpected places. Lou Reed, known for his gritty stories of the New York underground, penned Dirt, which some interpret as referencing Bobby's fate or at least evoking the dark underbelly of the music world. Various magazines covered the story with sensational headlines, leaning into the gangster rumors or the LSD party gone wrong. Fans wrote letters to local newspapers demanding further investigation. Over time, Bobby's name might have faded from mainstream pop culture, overshadowed by the flamboyant superstars of the late 1960s and 1970s. But his influence was still there, pulsing like an undertone in the rock narrative. His story would reemerge periodically, each time prompting a new generation of music enthusiasts to dive into the complexities of his brief yet radiant career and bizarre death. If there's a silver lining in this tragic tale, it might be how Bobby's life serves as a reminder of the artistry that can flourish under difficult circumstances. He wasn't a product of a polished Hollywood system. He was a self-made phenomenon, pushing through obstacles with little more than raw talent and the support of a small but dedicated band. His success story, up until that ill-fated day in 1966, highlights the possibilities that come from taking risks, whether that means building a club in your hometown or refusing to buckle under a record executive's demands. For artists now who face their own modern version of the music industry's perils, streaming monopolies, viral fame's fleeting nature, social media controversies, Bobby's story is a potent cautionary tale about the importance of maintaining artistic integrity and personal safety. Yet the greatest enigma remains unsolved. Who, if anyone, is responsible for Bobby Fuller's untimely passing? Could it have been the result of an impulsive or mismanaged exit from the record label? Did moneyed interests and mob figures see Bobby as a loose end that needed tying up? Was it simply a case of an accidental overdose, with panicked friends staging the scene poorly? Could an obsessive lover or a jealous competitor have played a role? Or was the official narrative somewhat true, that perhaps Bobby was consumed by despair, making the improbably desperate choice to end his life in that gruesome manner? Despite all the speculation, no conclusive evidence has emerged to implicate a specific individual or group. The mishandled crime scene destroyed key leads, and any potential witnesses either weren't interviewed properly or were too frightened to come forward. The momentum of the investigation died quickly, pushed aside by the city's bigger news stories, like the LAPD grappling with internal changes after their chief's death, and the broader cultural shifts that were turning the Summer of Love into a national obsession. Soon enough, the world moved on to the next headlines: the escalation in Vietnam, political assassinations, and the wave of new revolutionary rock music. In that whirlwind, Bobby Fuller's tragedy risked being relegated to a footnote, another sad statistic in the ledger of dreamers who didn't make it. But rock music histories have a way of resurrecting lost icons, especially when the story carries as many dramatic elements as Bobby Fuller's does. His discography, though not vast, showed a remarkable ability to fuse influences and produce something undeniably American, an amalgamation of Texas swagger, Buddy Holly's melodic instincts, and the forward drive that rock and roll promised. Long after Bobby's passing, fans continued to spin his records, each scratch on the vinyl telling its own story of youthful optimism and heartbreak. It's a testament to Bobby's unique talent that I Fought the Law remains instantly recognizable to this day, often covered by bands that might not even fully realize the tragedy that befell its best-known interpreter. Looking back with decades of hindsight, the entire saga reminds us of how precarious fame can be. In 1966, Bobby Fuller was on the cusp of major stardom. He had a top 10 hit at a time when the charts were dominated by British imports and seasoned American acts. He showed that a kid from El Paso, armed with a guitar and a relentless work ethic, could climb those ranks. Yet his biggest triumph quickly intertwined with his greatest vulnerability, entering into business relationships that might have been more dangerous than he could handle, and mingling in a scene rife with power plays and hidden agendas. The rock and roll spirit that propelled him from local clubs to national charts also made him a potential target in a jungle where not everyone shared his passion for music over profit. All these years later, the Bobby Fuller mystery stands as a classic Hollywood story. It's got all the elements: a hopeful newcomer, an ambitious dream, questionable deals, a shocking death, and a trail of unanswered questions. While officialdom seems unlikely to reopen the case, the legend persists, fueled by documentaries, articles, fan discussions, and the detective work of curious writers who just can't let the case rest. Maybe the truth is buried in old police files, lost recordings, or the memories of someone who was threatened into silence. Or maybe it's gone forever, drowned out by the noise of an era that devoured many of its young talents. What remains indisputable is that Bobby Fuller's life was a collision of brilliance and vulnerability, a meteoric rise cut short by an event so dark and inexplicable that it casts a long shadow over the sunlit idealism of 1960s rock. The cautionary lessons from his story are as relevant now as they were then. The music business can be a thrilling but treacherous place. Big dreams can end in heartbreak if the wrong people are challenged. And true talent sometimes isn't enough to protect you from the forces conspiring in the background. But there's also an uplifting note in the enduring power of his music and the loyal fan base that refuses to forget him. With each new generation that stumbles upon I Fought the Law, curiosity about Bobby's story is rekindled, keeping his memory alive and ensuring that his songs remain part of the ongoing dialogue of rock history. In the end, Bobby Fuller's legacy is part triumph, part tragedy, an echo of a youth culture that thrived on the defiant spark of creativity and bold risk-taking, and a haunting reminder of how quickly that spark can be snuffed out. He might have been another name on the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame roster had fate dealt him a better hand, but instead we're left with the heartbreakingly unfinished nature of his career and the nagging sense that the reasons for his death lie behind closed doors. As the years roll on, theories might shift and new rumors might surface, but the essential enigma remains. Bobby Fuller fought the law, or something like it, and lost. Yet in losing, he immortalized himself in the pantheon of rock legends, an artist whose ultimate destiny no one could have predicted, and whose final act remains one of the most perplexing tales in modern music. And somewhere, in a ghostly echo that resonates through time, his guitar licks and that signature voice still call out, reminding us of a talent that burned bright in the 1960s, California sun, only to vanish in the most unexpected and unsettling way.